What I just saw was boom. It lifted me up and brought me back onto the ground. It was a big blast. All I saw was my leg burning.
She was too young at the time to understand what happened to her. As time went on, she grew to understand her situation. Her leg then started decaying. Elizabeth Asantua's leg was amputated to prevent the spread of the impact of the bomb explosion so she can continue to live. Her disfigured supporting leg is decaying by the day. She usually walks with the support of crutches.
The woman you just watched is the late Madam Elizabeth Asantua. She passed on the 2nd of June 2021. For most of her life, she had to endure untold suffering as a result of the terrorism the opponents of Kwame Nkrumah resorted to in the 1950s and 60s. In spite of the very tragic predicament she had to face for decades after that day, it can be said that she was in fact one of the few lucky ones, as many other innocent Ghanaians, including children like her, lost their lives due to the bomb throwing in Ghana. These numerous bombing incidents has led to the misconception amongst many that Madam Elizabeth Asantua was a victim of the Kulungugu bombing, but the child killed in that incident was in fact a schoolboy. Unfortunately, the name of that innocent schoolboy appears unknown in the history books. The Kulungugu bombing incident, which was a direct assassination attempt on Kwame Nkrumah, also resulted in serious injuries to 56 people. It occurred on the 1st of August 1962, and in the following month, there will be 2 more bombing incidents. The second incident took place on the 9th of September when a bomb exploded in the midst of a crowd that had gathered outside the official residence of President Nkrumah. This resulted in the killing of 2 people, with at least 63 people suffering injuries. It is believed that at the time the bomb went off, the president was outside to meet the crowd that had gathered, but he was fortunately not near the site of explosion. Just 9 days later, another bomb explosion would take place as thousands were taking part in a torchlight procession on the eve of President Nkrumah's birthday. 3 innocent Ghanaians were killed in this incident, with about 120 suffering injuries. There was also the assassination attempt on President Nkrumah on the 2nd of January 1964 by a police officer. The president only survived because Chief Superintendent Salifu Dagati, a loyal police officer, shielded him from the assassin's bullets. The New York Times report on this incident carried the headline, "Nkrumah escapes assassin, 5th time." These are just some instances of the terrorism that was inflicted on the people of Ghana and their president, Kwame Nkrumah, by individuals and groups who were determined to eliminate Nkrumah by all means and at any cost. Most incredible is the fact that all the bombing incidents that I have highlighted took place at least 4 years after the passing of the Preventive Detention Act. So not even the existence of the supposedly draconian PDA was enough to deter the terroristic opponents of Kwame Nkrumah. In fact, if anything, the murder and maiming of innocent children and other citizens went up to unprecedented levels. One wonders what a president and his government should do in the face of such unbridled terrorism. It is important to lay out all these facts to give proper perspective before we go on to find out where the idea for the PDA came from, the justifications for it, and why it was introduced. First, it is important to note the political climate that existed in Ghana in the years right before independence in 1957. This period was fraught with violence, mainly from the opposition party to the CPP, known as the National Liberation Movement. Formed after the 1954 elections, where the CPP secured another overwhelming victory, the NLM will seek to use every possible means to overcome the dominance of the CPP. First, the NLM will seek to cause disaffection for the Nkrumah government over the introduction of the Cocoa Duty and Development Funds Bill. The effect of this bill was to fix the price paid to the cocoa farmers at 72 shillings a load for 4 years. Cocoa prices were subject to frequent fluctuations and the government made the decision to take measures to create a special fund to guarantee a reasonable price to be paid to cocoa farmers in the event of low world prices for cocoa. At the time the bill was introduced, cocoa prices were at a record high, and the government intended to also use some of the cocoa funds for national development. According to Kwame Nkrumah, the government guaranteed to pay this price irrespective of how low the world price of cocoa might fall during that period of time, and the funds that accrue to the government would be used on expanding the economy of the country as a whole, with special emphasis on agriculture. It was this situation that the opponents of Nkrumah sought to capitalize on in order to cause disaffection for him and his government. They met with cocoa farmers in the Ashanti region and deliberately misinterpreted the purpose of the new law. They told the farmers that even though the world price for cocoa was very high, the Nkrumah government had decided to pay them only a small amount. This propaganda campaign was effective and some farmers bought into it. The anti-Nkrumah opposition will come together to form the Council for Higher Cocoa Prices, which will soon be succeeded by the National Liberation Movement. The National Liberation Movement's main objective was to demand for a federal system of government. In the words of Nkrumah, supporters of this movement endeavored at first to spread discontent with the government throughout Ashanti by what they alleged to be the injustice of the cocoa bill to the Ashanti farmers, and tried to convince the people of how much better off they would be if they managed their own affairs. But the political agitation and campaigns by the NLM will ultimately not amount to much, and this will see them engage in a campaign of violence and terror. The situation will deteriorate so badly that hundreds of CPP supporters will have to flee their homes in the Ashanti region to seek refuge elsewhere in the country. Amongst the many casualties of the violence was Kofi Banda, a CPP activist who was shot dead at a rally in Ejiso. The sister of Krobo Eduse, who was then the National Propaganda Secretary of the CPP, was also murdered in cold blood as she was preparing food for her children. Amidst all this, Kwame Nkrumah insisted on restraints from CPP supporters who were determined to strike back in response to the violence from the NLM. The reason for Nkrumah's calm posture was due to the fact that a response in kind from CPP supporters was going to most likely result in a civil war, and this would have seriously derailed the march towards independence. During this period, the British colonialists still had control over the army and the police, but they did little to deal with the violence and the terror of the NLM. In November 1955, the Prime Minister himself, Kwame Nkrumah, will become a target of this violence, as his house in Accra, Newtown, was bombed in an attempt to assassinate him. Nkrumah was at home with his mother and a few other people when this happened, but all of them managed to escape unhurt. Here is how Nkrumah recounted the incident. We were still sitting in our chairs when a bright orange glow suddenly lit up the whole of the back of the house, and there was a violent explosion, followed within seconds by another. The house trembled, windows were blown in, and we could hear the screams of women and children. I went downstairs to find my mother, whose room was very near the explosion. The poor woman was speechless, and there were tears in her eyes as she clutched hold of my arm. "Oh, you are safe," she said with relief. I went into her room. There were no windows anymore, and the shattered glass was all over the place, even in her bed. By December 1955, over 850 cases of assault had been reported in Kumasi alone, of which less than a third had been brought to the courts. Another security threat the Nkrumah government was faced with right before independence in March 1957 was the problem of separatism in the Volta region. Supporters of the Togoland Congress Party were found setting up military camps in Alavanyo as part of their plans to carry out violent attacks together with elements of the NLM. The police moved in to dismantle the camp, and in the ensuing riots, 3 people were killed. 2 members of parliament, S.G. Anto and Kofi Ayeke, were arrested and charged with complicity in the Alavanyo riots. After independence, the NLM continued with its campaign of violence in Kumasi, and there was evidence of arms smuggling across the border from Ivory Coast into Ashanti. Over 5,000 people, originally living in Ashanti, had been exiled as a result of the NLM's violence. And in a declassified telegram from the US Embassy in Accra to the State Department, dated December 4, 1957, the US ambassador to Ghana at the time, Wilson C. Flake, revealed attempts by opposition leader Dr. Kofi Abrefa-Buzia to gain assistance from the US government. Dr. Buzia wanted the US government to provide $25,000 in assistance to the opposition to help counter the dominance of the CPP. He also wanted the US government to rally public opinion against the Nkrumah government. It was against this backdrop of unbridled violence and connivance with foreign governments by the opposition that in December 1957, Krobo Edusei, then serving as Ghana's Interior Minister, first suggested the idea of the Preventive Detention Act in the National Assembly. This was after he had seen a copy of the Indian law that allowed for preventive detention. 2 months on, in February 1958, Krobo Edusei threatened to introduce a law that was based on the Indian Act when Parliament resumed, but he was overruled by Prime Minister Nkrumah and his cabinet. According to Ghana's Attorney General then, Geoffrey, at that time, it seemed the government had definitely decided against it. But all of this would change a few months later when the police discovered that Reginald Reynolds Samponsa had purchased military accoutrements in London and that the Gyamerah had set up a secret organization to carry out violence and possibly assassinate the Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah. Reginald Reynolds Samponsa, known popularly as R.R. Amponsa, was the General Secretary of the United Party, a party that was a combination of many of the tribal and religious groups that opposed Nkrumah. It had been revealed to the police that in June 1958, R.R. Amponsa traveled to London and visited Badges and Equipments, a well-known shop in London. He spent £130 to buy 280 pips as worn by army captains and lieutenants, 50 army swagger canes, and 24 Sam Brown belts. R.R. Amponsa introduced himself as Johnny Walker and made the purchases under that name. The information about R.R. Amponsa's activities in London were provided to the police by a tip-off from a staff at Badges and Equipments. On 18 July 1958, the Preventive Detention Act was passed by the National Assembly. This act made it possible to detain a person without trial for up to 5 years for conduct prejudicial to the defense and security of the state and its foreign relations. Reacting to concerns over the new legislation, Nkrumah said, "Firstly, the only persons who need to be alarmed about it are those who are either attempting to organize violence, terrorism, or civil war, or who are acting as faith columnists for some foreign power interested in subversion in Ghana. Secondly, the bill has been deliberately drafted so that the government can deal with any attempt to subvert the state by force. Thirdly, the government is determined to preserve in Ghana both justice and freedom." Shortly after the PDA came into force, a dangerous tribal conspiracy was discovered by the police. This involved the Ghana Stand Fast organization, known popularly as the Gyamerah, a group that had been formed because there were some indigents of Accra who felt Ghanaians from other parts of the country had taken over Accra from them. Even when the Avoidance of Discrimination Act was passed after independence to outlaw any tribal, regional, or religious political groups, resulting in most of such opposition groups coming together to form the United Party, the Gyamerah refused to accept this and continued to operate as a conspiratorial organization. Police records showed that most of the leaders of this organization had long experience of violence and thuggery. The reports from spies the police had planted within their ranks about their plans were highly worrying. The Gyamerah created 2 wings, the Tokyo Joes and the Zenith 10 cells. The members of these cells were made to take secret oaths, and the leadership, it was said, only appeared at secret meetings in dark rooms with masks on their face. These groups, according to police intelligence, were created for the purpose of violence and the possible assassination of the Prime Minister, Kwame Nkrumah. Due to all of this, according to the Attorney General at the time, Geoffrey, the Special Branch were highly apprehensive of a possible breakdown in law and order if this organization was not broken up. Consequently, in November 1958, 43 members of the Tokyo Joes and the Zenith 10 cells were arrested under the Preventive Detention Act. These included former CPP politicians Ashini Koi and Jenkle Jewu. According to As outlined by the police, the evidence of their direction of and involvement with the Gyamerah seemed conclusive, and previously a parliamentary select committee had heard evidence which had suggested they had been engaged in circulating forged cabinet papers. On why they were not put on trial but held under preventive detention, this is what Bing had to say. I discussed with James McCabe attempting to bring some at least of the persons concerned to trial. Modesto Apalu, for example, who was said to have addressed one of these meetings, but he took the view that any prosecution would disclose inevitably the very tenuous system which the police had built up in order to obtain information of what was going on, and for this reason alone, it should not be attempted. 1 month on, in December 1958, R.R. Amponsa and Modesto Apalu will be arrested and put in jail under the Preventive Detention Act. Remember the tip-off the police had received that R.R. Amponsa had bought military accoutrements in London? Well, these items were sent to an address in Lome that belonged to Modesto Apalu. Even though the police had received the tip-off in June 1958, no arrests were made until the two men were implicated by Major Benjamin Awaite. Major Awaite was the camp commandant of the Gifford camp. He had been charged with neglect to the prejudice of good order and military discipline, in that he at Accra on the 18th and 19th December 1958 failed to report until after he had learned that the matter had been reported by others, that he had been informed of a proposed coup d'etat being organized by one Reginald Reynolds Amponsa and others, which coup d'etat involved inter alia the seizure of the Prime Minister Dr. Nkrumah and other cabinet ministers by military personnel on the 20th December 1958. The case against Major Awaite centered on a report that had been made by a Lieutenant Amenya to a senior British officer called Major Tramper. According to Lieutenant Amenya, Major Awaite invited him to his office and said, "I have information of a confidential nature to tell you." He then went on to confide in him that two members of parliament, R.R. Amponsa and Modesto Apalu, had visited him the previous night on the 18th of December, and they had brought with them some army uniforms with badges of rank and £50 in cash. Lieutenant Amenya continued that Major Awaite then showed him a briefcase on the table in his office and said that at that very moment, the money was in the case. According to him, Major Awaite had told him that the two members of parliament had asked them to call up some army non-commissioned officers and bribing them with the £50, get them to cause a coup d'etat and assassinate Dr. Nkrumah when he was about to board his aircraft for India the next morning. Major Awaite then told Lieutenant Amenya that he had thought about the whole scheme and had decided he would not do it, but he wanted Amenya to go and meet Amponsa and Apalu at the already decided meeting place and tell them it would not be possible for Major Awaite to carry out the coup d'etat. Lieutenant Amenya agreed to carry out this task for Major Awaite, but after leaving the latter's office, went to report all that he had been told to his superior, Major Tramper. Major Awaite was immediately arrested by the army authorities. The head of the special branch was then consulted, and he directed Amenya to keep the appointment as had been arranged by Awaite. Lieutenant Amenya duly made his way to the meeting place, and a car came by after he had waited for some minutes. He approached the car and found only one man in it. He asked the man if he was Mr. Amponsa, and the man confirmed that yes, he was the one. According to Amenya, he then got into the car and clearly recognized him. He went on to give him the message from Major Awaite, and according to him, R.R. Amponsa told him to go and ask Awaite what time it would be convenient for them to meet, and that he was going to wait at the same place for the answer. Lieutenant Amenya then returned to the Gifford camp and reported what happened at the meeting to his senior officers. On the orders of his superiors, he was later to return to meet R.R. Amponsa at the same place a short while later, but just as he was getting into the car, the police appeared on the scene. They asked R.R. Amponsa what he was doing there, and he claimed he had an appointment there with Modesto Apalu. He was thereupon put under arrest by the police. This claim by Amponsa will be categorically denied later on by Apalu during the inquiry into this saga. At this point, Major Awaite had been questioned and had given a statement that differed in some parts from what Lieutenant Amenya said he had told him. The essence of his statement was that at 6:30 on the night of 18 December, a driver whose name he did not know came to his house to inform him that he was wanted at Labadi by his uncle, who was the chief of Dodowa, in order to accompany him to see a lawyer. He duly agreed to go with the driver in a car, and on arriving in Labadi, he met a man who turned out to be R.R. Amponsa. Amponsa then asked them if he remembered their meeting at Wesley College some 20 years ago, and in response, Awaite says, "Oh yes, I do remember. What can I do for you?" Amponsa then says, "You know, we the opposition have helped the army a great deal, and the only way we expect you to express your gratitude is to come to our support." Awaite then questioned him as to how the army could help the opposition, as they were non-political. To this, Amponsa responded, "Oh, you know, coup d'etat, the Prime Minister will be leaving for India on Saturday, 26 December 1958, and if you could induce your NCOs to help in arresting him and other cabinet ministers who are going to see him off at the airport, we might overthrow the government and come into power. All of you in the army would then be better off." At this point, according to Awaite, Amponsa dipped his right hand into his pocket, showed him a bundle of money, and said, "Look, take this £50 to your NCOs and induce them by all means to support us." Responding to this, Awaite says, "Don't be silly. I am not prepared to take this." In reaction to this, Amponsa then takes Awaite to the back of his car, opens a suitcase and says, "Look, all these uniforms will be given to your men if they come to our support." Awaite then wonders why he is the one Amponsa chose to approach with this dangerous plan and not any of the senior Ghanaian officers, to which Amponsa replies, "You see, we understand you are the camp commandant in charge of all the troops in Accra. That is why I sent for you." He then goes on to ask Awaite to remember all the opposition had done for the army in terms of improving their working conditions. R.R. Amponsa then asked Major Awaite to meet him at the exact spot and time that Awaite gave to Lieutenant Amenya. On the 21st of January 1959, a court-martial was assembled by the then commander of the Ghana Army, Sir Victor Paley. Major Awaite, who was then one of the most senior Ghanaian officers in the army, will be tried by a panel of 5 officers, 2 British and 3 Ghanaians. The Ghanaian officers were Major A.K. Okran, Major Charles Mohammed Bawa, and Major Ankra. The 5-man panel will eventually find Major Awaite guilty, and this will lead to his dismissal from the army. Consequently, the Nkrumah government will institute a full-scale quasi-judicial investigation into the matters disclosed at the court-martial of Benjamin Awaite and the surrounding circumstances. A commission of inquiry was duly established for this purpose. It had 3 members. The chairman was Mr. Gilbert Granville Sharp, a respected British jurist who was then serving as a judge at the Court of Appeal. The second member was Mr. Maurice Charles, a senior West Indian magistrate, and the third member of the commission was Sir Nana Tibudako, formerly of the Gold Coast Legislative Council. The hearings of the commission were public, and the accused were represented by counsel, Dr. J.B. Danko and Mr. Koy Labi for Mr. Amponsa and Mr. Apalu. Evidence was heard in 6 languages, Ga, Twi, English, Ewe, and Adangbe, from 97 witnesses. A central focus of the commission were the events that occurred earlier in June 1958 that involved R.R. Amponsa and Modesto Apalu, which up until then had been the subject of covert investigation by the intelligence services. The manager of the London shop, Barges and Equipment, A.D. Glennie, came to Accra to give evidence, which established that R.R. Amponsa had spent £130 in London in buying under the name of Johnny Walker, 280 pips as won by army captains and lieutenants, 50 officer swagger canes, and 24 some brown belts. Also, it was proven that Amponsa had ordered from Barges and Equipment's 50 officer hackles. These hackles were plumes worn in the tropical headgear of Ghanaian officers. R.R. Amponsa requested that the hackles be sent to Lome, to what turned out to be an address that belonged to Modesto Apalu, who it was established subsequently collected them through an intermediary. Modesto Apalu was the deputy leader of the opposition in parliament. Neither Amponsa nor Apalu were able to give any convincing explanation for why they had obtained these items. In his appearance before the commission, The head of the special branch, James McCabe, said in response to a question from the chairman, "I think it might be helpful, my lord, in considering what might have been going to happen, to consider what in fact happened in Burma in 1946. When asked what happened in Burma by the Attorney General Geoffrey, McCabe said, "In 1946 in Burma, a group of the opposition party dressed themselves up in military uniforms, stole an army truck, and went into the cabinet room and massacred 14 of the entire cabinet." This reference was important because Burma was the country outside Ghana that was best known to the army at the time, and Major Awaite himself had served there from 1943 to 1946. After sitting for 29 days, the commission, following long deliberations, issued 3 reports: a unanimous report, a majority report, and a minority report. In their unanimous report, they found that Amponsa and Apalu since June 1958 were engaged in a conspiracy to carry out at some future date in Ghana an act for unlawful purpose, revolutionary in character. What they were unable to agree upon was what was the nature of this act for an unlawful purpose, revolutionary in character. The majority of the commission, Sir Tibudako and Mr. Maurice Charles, found that Awaite, Amponsa and Apalu were engaged in a conspiracy to assassinate the Prime Minister, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and carry out a coup d'etat. Justice Granville Sharp, in his minority report, however, argued that Amponsa and Apalu had withdrawn from the conspiracy when they suspected that the police were privy to it and that Awaite was not a co-conspirator. Thus, he found that there did not exist between Amponsa, Apalu, and Awaite a plot to interfere in any way with the life of the Prime Minister at the airport before his departure for India. With this outcome from the Commission of Inquiry, the government could not be expected to release the individuals whom a majority of the commission had found were engaged in a plot to murder the head of the government. But at the same time, it was almost certain that no successful prosecution could be launched against those concerned when a judge of the Court of Appeal had come to the conclusion that, though they had been involved in conspiracy, it was impossible to determine what this conspiracy was, and that they had abandoned their plans, whatever they were, prior to the date on which they were to be carried out. It is precisely because of these two contradictory findings that the government chose to detain R.R. Amponsa and Modesto Apalu under the Preventive Detention Act. The outcome of the Awaite inquiry proved that the PDA was necessary in Ghana at the time. In spite of the unanimous findings of the Commission of Inquiry, the opposition continued to defend Amponsa and Apalu and attack the integrity of the majority of the commission. The opposition United Party refused to accept the commission's unanimous findings or to in any way disown Amponsa and Apalu's actions. In the words of Geoffrey, the Awaite matter created in the minds of the government the impression, never to be eradicated, that the United Party as a party would condone and perhaps actively support any illegal means of overthrowing the government. Thus, preventive detention, which when established was only to be used in an emergency, now began more and more to be regarded as the sheet anchor of stability, and the old reluctance to use it largely disappeared. The primary reason why preventive detention was preferred was, in the words of Geoffrey, because of the rigidity of English laws of evidence and procedure and their perhaps too dogmatic enforcement in circumstances for which they were never designed. This had made it near impossible for the courts in Ghana to effectively check political conspiracy. In a newly independent African country like Ghana was then, there were many limitations, and this included the very limited capacity of the police. This made it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to punish treasonable or seditious offenses under the existing system because of the deficiencies in the machinery for collecting the necessary evidence and because of the need for establishing under English laws of evidence that certainty of guilt required under the British system. This meant that neither the police nor the courts in Ghana were capable of dealing with political crime. For the Attorney General, Geoffrey, the trouble with preventive detention as applied in Ghana was that its fairness or otherwise depended upon the efficiency of the police investigation And thus, the new remedy was likely to be only slightly more effective than the court system, so far as public security was concerned, and much worse, so far as the rights of the individual were involved. Yet, given the circumstances, what else was possible? It is this question of what the better alternative was that the critics of the Preventive Detention Act then failed to answer. Even till date, those who still seek to use the PDA as a stick to beat Nkrumah with are unable to say what exactly he should have done to the people behind the many assassination and bombing plots. It must be stated for the records that Geoffrey, as the Attorney General, was personally opposed to the introduction of the PDA. In fact, he had always been opposed in principle to the idea of preventive detention throughout his years as a member of the British Parliament. During his time in the British Parliament, Byng came up with an amendment that was going to prohibit preventive detention in Northern Ireland. After the First World War, a special powers bill had been introduced in Northern Ireland that made it legal to imprison political offenders without trial. Byng's attempt at repealing this legal provision failed because he had so little support from his fellow members of parliament, and that discouraged him from even bringing forward his amendment proposal for fear of showing the smallness of the anti-preventive detention vote. Years later, Byng will remark, "In view of the volume of the criticism which followed the introduction of preventive detention in Ghana, it was, I think, remarkable looking back on it that I could find so little enthusiasm for my proposal to make it illegal in the United Kingdom." Not only did British parliamentarians defend the use of preventive detention in Northern Ireland, they also supported its widespread use in British colonies like Kenya. In the words of Geoffrey Byng, far from preventive detention being condemned on principle and alternatives suggested, the British Colonial Office view was that it was not only a highly necessary but also a highly moral and reformatory instrument of government whose general use in Africa should be advocated rather than explained away or excused as due to special circumstances in some particular territory. In 1960, the police will make an urgent request to the government for the PDA to be extended to cover gangsters and criminals. They argued that in the same way as it was impossible to prove in court a political offense, so it was equally impossible by way of the courts to deal with the new type of gangsters who were then, it was said, beginning to organize themselves on an American pattern. In the aftermath of the 1966 coup, around half of the detainees released by the NLC regime were in fact criminal detainees, but they were all released and passed off as political prisoners. This was so as to create a false picture that the Nkrumah government had used the PDA indiscriminately against political opponents. The release of many criminal detainees will lead to a predictable rise in crime in Ghana in the following months. Extraordinary times, as they say, require extraordinary measures. And history shows that when governments have been faced with serious security challenges, serious and often extraordinary measures have been taken. In 1861, the then President of the United States of America, Abraham Lincoln, found reason enough to suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the legal principle that protects people from unlawful detention by requiring the government to bring detained individuals before a court and justify their imprisonment. This was seen then and now as a fundamental human right. But when the President of the United States felt that the nation faced an existential threat, he did not hesitate to suspend it. In fact, this was done without the approval of Congress, and it was only in 1863 that the US Congress passed a law to formalize the suspension of habeas corpus by the President. There was also the already mentioned Special Powers Act in Northern Ireland, which allowed for detention without trial for political offenses. Although originally presented as a temporary emergency measure, the Special Powers Act remained in force in Northern Ireland for over 50 years. In the 21st century, the terrorist attacks in the US on September 11, 2001 led to the introduction of anti-terrorism laws that significantly expanded state security powers. In the US, the Patriot Act was passed and, among other things, made it possible for the US government to detain non-citizens suspected of terrorism or deemed threats to national security including permitting detention for periods without ordinary criminal trial under certain circumstances. In the UK, the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act 2001 was passed under Prime Minister Tony Blair, and it allowed for the detention without trial of certain foreign terror suspects who could not be deported. In both countries, there were many critics who argued that these laws infringed on human rights of people and weakened civil liberties. But there were also many supporters who argued that these laws were necessary to prevent catastrophic terrorist attacks, the kinds of which the PDA in Ghana was intended to prevent, but failed to in fact. It was in the early 1960s that terrorist attacks in Ghana reached their height. This was when Madam Elizabeth Asantewaa met her unfortunate fate. Many other innocent Ghanaians will be injured and others killed, including the child who died in the Kulungugu bombing incident, when a bomb was thrown at President Nkrumah in an attempt to assassinate him. It cannot be denied that there were some among the political detainees who were wrongly detained because some in the police wanted to settle scores or had their own agenda. When one considers the fact that among the leaders of the coup makers in 1966 were the heads of police, one can only imagine the work they had done to undermine the Nkrumah government up till that point. But when all the facts are considered, especially the many terrorist attacks and assassination attempts on the president, the necessity for the PDA cannot be denied. In his book about his time in Ghana, Geoffrey compares the attitude towards political prisoners by the Nkrumah government and European governments at certain points. In fact, if one contrasts the attitude towards political prisoners in Ghana with that exhibited by European governments in the pre- and post-war years, what stands out is the humanity of Ghanaian behavior as compared to that of supposedly more civilized nations. In Ghana, unlike in pre-war and wartime Germany, there were no concentration camps, let alone gas chambers. No detainees were beaten to death as they were in Kenya at a contemporary period, nor were they tortured to death as happened in the last stages of colonialism in Algeria. What is in fact remarkable is that the present military regime have been unable to dig up any authenticated case of ill treatment or indeed any execution for treason or subversion. This humane treatment of political prisoners by the Nkrumah government was typified by the expert medical attention one of the members of the Big Six, Emmanuel Obi-Lamte, received when he was in detention. He had been charged with organizing terrorist bomb attacks in which 30 persons lost their lives and some 300 others had been seriously injured. At the time of his arrest, he was suffering from an advanced stage of liver cancer, but in spite of the atrocities he had been found to be involved in, he was placed in a private ward in one of the best equipped civilian hospitals in Accra and had all the drugs and attention possible provided for him by the government. To end, here is a clip of Major Retired Gbeku Osagyefo repeating the question President Nkrumah used to ask his aides on the use of the PDA.
The Preventive Detention Act, he asked us a question, say, look, if some of you were in my position, you take it that you are a father to some people. Your children went to school. Some of them will never come back home. People who wanted to overthrow me, they started throwing bombs. Innocent people being killed here and there. You, what will you have done?
At this point, I need to call on you to please consider supporting our work financially so we can keep this going, as it takes a lot to make these videos. So if you see any value in our content, please consider supporting. The links to do so are in the description box of this video. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it to others. It goes a long way. Asante sana.